First off, on my way here, some of the young reporters from the Age said, "We're going to heckle you." I have a two-word response for that, voluntary redundancy. Most of you would have seen Ron is a household name. You would have seen him at crime scenes on the television. He is the face of homicide. He's done more stand-ups than Jerry Lewis, and he's been spotted outside houses and photographed more times than James Hird. So how on earth did Ron make this journey? Because he was a young boy at Echuca in a dairy farm, and he would help his father milk 120 cows, then come in and watch the black and white television, which of course was homicide. And watching Leonard Teal and the boys with the pork pie hats, he thought, that's the job for me. So he joined the police force, and of course he fitted the qualifications of the day in that he was 6'3" and he didn't have a criminal record. He also had his own teeth, which was considered, he was officer material basically. So after several years he moved to homicide. In 1980 he did his first murder investigation, which was Maria Teresa James, out at the Thornbury bookshop. Coincidentally, that happened to be the first murder I covered for the Sun newspaper. I remember being outside there, and it had been a rainy day. It surprised me when I picked up the last edition of the Herald, and it said detectives entered the property by stepping over pools of blood. It had simply been raining. The reporter was Steve Price, which is probably why he now works the evening shift on Sydney radio. Ron actually helped change homicide from a fairly rustic art into a much more sophisticated skill set. Certainly in the old days, the interview methodology was robust, to say the least. There was a veteran homicide detective who had just finished his normal lunch, which was 6 pots and a packet of chips, when he returned to find 2 of his younger members in the interview room with a young person who they were giving a cup of coffee to and were helping him, giving him a light and a cigarette. This disgusted the older, hard-edged bloke who came in, picked the bloke up, threw him against the wall and said, "Mate, I've been doing this for 10 years. I can smell a murderer," before punching him between the eyes. As the 2 detectives said, "Boss, that's the witness." In those days, there was a sign above the homicide interview room which said, "You enter here with good looks and the truth. You can't leave with both." So they were the old days, but Ron came along and he's done, I think, 230 murder investigations with a success rate of almost Bradman-like 95%. He's been very innovative in the area of cold cases. He brought in what was known as the Canadian method, which is an undercover method which has been used throughout Australia with great success on some of the most mysterious murders that we've seen. He also brought in a less formal interview practice, which made a suspect feel at home. Now, you've got to remember what sort of rage one must feel at times in dealing with someone who's committed such a horrible crime. And sometimes the offender in this case wants validation. And I remember seeing an interview that Ron did. You might remember the terrible case of a little Indian infant who was found dead on the side of the road, and eventually a taxi driver was charged with the offence. And in that interview there was no official sort of table, there was no sort of the paraphernalia of a formal interview. And the fella gave his alibi, which included a few lies that he'd been working that particular day. And Ron didn't confront him, but gently said, "Well, that can't be true because I've already checked that." And then the guy was wavering, and Ron was saying, "Look, I think you're not a bad man. I think that something bad has really happened, and here's a chance for you to tell it." The guy then said, "Can you turn off the tape?" And Ron said, "I can't, it's there to protect you." And then the fella just sort of broke down and virtually held Ron's hand as he said that this poor little kid had run and hit a door, knocked himself out. This fellow, who was an elite, was frightened he was going to be sent out of the country, took the kid, put it in the boot of the car, drove around trying to find a hospital, and panicked, and the child died of heat exposure. It was a terrible, terrible event, but what was really interesting is that the offender at the end of it said, "I want to see the parents and I want to explain it." And without that confession, the the pathology reports wouldn't have been enough to convict the guy. So it was a simple case of being able to do that job at that time resulted in a successful conclusion, which is probably what Ron's best known for, in that he has a really good relationship with many of the people that he's locked up because he's always treated them fairly. I know that because once I went with Ron to give a speech up in Echuca, and I thought we'd probably solve the Beaumonts on the way, but sadly, on the way, he was on the phone the whole bloody time talking to an ex-informer who had a problem with his neighbour over a fence, and there's Ron trying to solve it on the way up. He then gave his speech on his day off, and I thought we'd finish the evening with some red wine and blue cheese, and then he gave me the horrible news that we were leaving at 5:30 in the morning because he had to be back to give a lecture to some more police. And the last time I was up at 5:30 in the morning involved a nasty bladder infection and a large hotel fish pond, but we don't want to talk about that. So that's the sort of work that he did there. Now, having finished his stint at Homicide, you would think he'd be looking for something a little bit more, less demanding. And yet, from the fire, he's jumped into the pot because he's now Secretary of the Police Association, which is another extremely demanding job. At a time when unions are losing their relevance, the Police Association has a membership of 98%. It's got about 43 or 44 million in assets and about 21 million in its legal defence fund. It's a union that hasn't gone on strike for 90 years and yet remains possibly the most powerful union in Victoria. And it doesn't need to employ Mick Gatto, and it doesn't need to employ sort of half-crazed psychopaths whose lives are based on violence, at least since the Major Crime Squad was dissolved. So he is in charge of this mob, and to give you an idea, it's a strong point to suggest that the Kennett government lost the election because it lost the Police Association. Law and order is, in this election and everyone in living memory, one of the key things in Victoria. The Police Association, as you saw in the Herald Sun earlier this week, can set the agenda not on matters simply about how many members and pay and conditions, but actually the whole law and order debate swings on them. So both the opposition and the government do not want to piss off the Police Association. So we're going to hear from Ron, who arguably may hold the key to what happens in November. Please welcome Ron Iddles.
Thanks, John. Today it's not about me, it's about moving from, I guess, an experienced homicide detective to being an advocate. I think the Police Association is an advocate for the 14,000 members that we represent, but secondly, we're also an advocate for the community. You know, our members ring us and tell us the concerns of the community, and that feeds into some of the decisions that we make around the executive table and at the administration. You know, I look around this room and it takes me back, I guess, to probably the early 1980s when I first did go to the homicide squad. You know, we used to often go up the country and go to a hotel similar to this because this has got a great country feel, and the only people that would be there at 11:30 at night were the journalists and the coppers. So this is very similar and it takes me back to that time. But I think we've moved a long way from where that was in 1980. You know, when I first went to the homicide squad in 1980, I think the relationship that detectives had with journalists, people in the media and reporters was far, far greater than what it is now. We didn't have latte, decaf lattes, soy lattes. We had international roast or caterer's blend. But the relationship that we had with the journalists, I think, was far, far better than what we do now. In Mackenzie Street, the side of Russell Street, was a small office. In that office was The Age, The Sun, the Herald, because it wasn't called the Herald Sun, Channel 7, Channel 9, Channel 10 were a little bit upmarket. They had an office across the road which was called The Lodge. But the majority of those journalists had total access to Russell Street. At 10:30 in the morning, Mike Gleeson, who wrote for the Herald, would wander in and go to floor and talk to you. And he would get his story and he would come back at 2:30 in the afternoon with the first edition of the Herald. We didn't have a media unit that controlled what we actually said. Relationships formed back then, I think, were far better relationships than what we have now between journalists and the majority of police officers. I met Dermot O'Brien, who's here, who was the director of Channel 10 News until recently when he took a package and retired. In 1980, he was a reporter for Channel 7. We formed a relationship and a friendship which has now lasted 35 years, and I thank him for flying in from Bangkok this morning. He could have been, and he was a great director, but he could have had every story about any homicide, but that relationship wasn't about that. Sadly, he didn't get any stories from me. Otherwise, Channel 10 would have been a far, far better news program than what it was. But today is about a transition for me. It's about leaving behind the title of being a veteran homicide detective and moving forward to being an advocate, as I said, for 14,000 members, and secondly, an advocate for the community. Today is about talking about the forthcoming election in November. Today is about police and certain things that we may ask for coming up to the election. In 2 to 3 weeks, we'll launch a campaign which will go for 3 to 4 months, right up until 29th of November. Hopefully during the next 3 to 4 months we can have an informed debate that's rational, that's productivity, that we can actually have a debate around a whole range of issues. To the current government, they must get some credit because come November they've delivered 17,000 extra members for Victoria Police. That came about because 4 years ago there was a public debate. That debate was about the fact that there was a lack of police officers within Victoria. It was a debate that the Police Association was in the middle of. But ultimately it was a debate that caused both political parties to have a bipartisan approach, and to Labor's credit, they came out first and said we'd have 1,700, which was followed by the Liberal National Party, which also said they would equal that and have 1,700. So as we move forward into the election, I now want to read from notes because there's some key messages that I want to talk about as we go forward. I think sometimes the major political parties currently think that because 1,700 police were delivered last time, the heavy lifting's done, it's finished. Well, I'm here to tell you it's not. Because the community tell us and our members tell us that they are stretched to the limit. So don't think, whatever political persuasion, that the job is done, because it's not. There's a lot more that needs to be done. All the authorities consistently talk about the overwhelming driver for police resources. And there can be no doubt that the overwhelming need for police resources relates to population growth. Victoria at the moment is enjoying the greatest population growth it's ever seen in the history of Victoria. It's predicted to go on for decades. By 2031, we understand that the population here in Melbourne, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, will outgrow Sydney. At least we'll beat them in something. Last year, the population in Victoria grew by 2% higher than the national average. The national average was 1.8% and the government forecast was 1.7%. Due to this massive increase in the population growth, there's increased demand pressures on all kinds of police services. There's demands extra on transport, trains, road health. 000 calls for services escalated to the extent where police are struggling to service that demand. It's got to be of major concern to all Victorians. Despite the increase in police numbers during the last 4 years, which was 1,700, we still have one of the lowest ratios per population. We currently sit around 102 police officers per 100,000. The Productivity Commission report says that puts us towards the bottom in relation to all states around Australia. With population growth comes often increased crime rates, so it's not surprisingly that crime rates are going up. The Chief Commissioner was on Neil Mitchell, 3AW, some time ago, and he talked about the increased demands on Victoria Police. He talked about that we can't basically service the 000 calls. He talked about that some crimes are unreported. They're going up where population is rising the fastest. Let's look at Wyndham. If you look at the crime statistics in Wyndham, which is down near Point Cook, assaults in the street, assaults in relation to personal matters is up 36%. Some crime rates have actually fallen. If you go to Ballarat, where they've got sufficient staff, sufficient blue shirts, police officers who are out patrolling, the crime rates have come down. Our research tells us just to keep pace with population growth, Victoria will need a substantial injection of first response police officers in the next 4 years. Victoria's population is anticipated to grow 8% over the next 4 years. Local government areas such as Wyndham is anticipated to grow 24%. The current amount of police officers in Wyndham today is 43 police officers per 100,000. They have less than what the state average is. They need a massive injection of police now, but they also need it over the four years to keep up with the current trend of population growth. We need police officers in Melbourne, extra police officers. We need them in the regional country areas, but especially in growth areas such as Doreen, Mernda, Whittlesea, Berwick South and Point Cook. If you go out and you look out past Whittlesea, I was out there about 5 years ago, and it was like a goat track heading up to Whittlesea. If you go out there now, there's a development on every major corner. We are seeking a commitment from all sides of politics for an extra 1,880 first response police officers over the next 4 years. As mediators of public debate, it's important for you journalists to understand how different interests are trying to frame the discussion and the terminology. I think there's been a massive change in the terminology. 4 years ago, there was a promise to deliver 1,700 frontline police officers. Well, to me, a frontline police officer is someone who wears a uniform, who drives the divisional van, who drives the marked police car. Of recent times, I've read in the paper comments from politicians, comments from senior police talking about the Echo Task Force front line, the Trident front line, the Trident Task Force front line, family violence front line. They're all great initiatives. They're all great members of ours and they do a great job. But they're not the first responders. When your loved one is walking down the street, whether it be your mother, your sister, your brother, and the ice addict is kicking them to death or seriously assaulting them, sadly it's not the task force who's coming out. It's not the chemist in a white coat that's coming out. The only one that can respond is the person in the blue uniform, that first responder. So what we're seeking is not 1,880 frontline police. What we're seeking is 1,880 first responders. You know, I drove in this morning, 5:30. Saturday I listened to 3AW. As I drive in, Kelly Yates, the media officer's on there at 10 to 6 talking about the crimes that happen overnight. He talks about a shooting in Springvale. She talks about a drug lab out in Dandenong that's been found. And she talks about the scene is being guarded by crime scene police officers. They are people in uniform who work the street. Quite often at a homicide scene in the last 12 months, I would arrive. The first question I got asked by the sergeant or the inspector is, Ron, when can you release this uniformed police member because I need it back on the road. What does that tell you? That tells you that we are lacking first response police officers in this community. Of the 1,700 new police officers that we've had since the last election, barely 1/3 of them have hit the street. Where are they? Well, we know that they're in task forces. We're not against task forces. We're not against those specialist squads. But the community need them on the street to actually respond to those OOO calls. The demand for police services in relation to family violence, mental illness has gone up astronomically. We've got to have those uniformed police on the street to serve the community. Some of our members are exhausted. They're stressed. They're frustrated. They're sick. I travel around the state, and where there's a shortage of first responders, you've only got to ask the boss there. Sick leave is going up. Depression is going up. Anxiety is going up. I looked at the trends in Ballarat where they have sufficient uniformed police there. All those key indicators are coming down. Recently, the Chief Commissioner issued his blue paper on the future of policing in Victoria. He says it's a discussion paper, it's not a policy, and we welcome that debate. The blue paper claims to be a visionary document, new initiatives developed by consultation. I've read the blue paper in detail, and I've also read the Tom Windsor report from the UK. In 2012, Tom Windsor was appointed the Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police in the UK. He was a direct entry. He was a lawyer prior to becoming the Chief Constable and an economic rationalist. He decided to do a review of the UK police, and he made some key recommendations, and the blue paper makes some key recommendations. One of the key recommendations out of the Windsor report in 2012 is that they have direct entry. One of the key recommendations out of the blue paper is that we have direct entry into Victoria Police. What does that mean? It means the manager of Bunnings can now become a senior police officer. If our officers don't have the current skills, why don't they? Because Victoria Police has failed to identify the issue and failed to train our officers sufficiently. It's an indictment on previous Chief Commissioners. Because if we say we don't have the current skill sets, then we've failed all along. Think of the senior sergeant who wants to be promoted to inspector. He's had 28 years in the job and he's dedicated his life to the community, and all of a sudden, someone from Bunnings comes in over the top of him. You devalue your staff. One of the other key things out of the Windsor report was identify talent, fast track it to the top. One of the key recommendations out of the blue paper, identify talent, fast track it to the top. One of the key recommendations out of the Windsor report was we don't want to privatise the police force, but we want to work in a partnership so that we can reduce costs. Key recommendation out of the blue paper is let's look at developing partnerships so that we can take some of the functions away from police. The classic, I think, is this. The Windsor report says community police are the bedrock of policing. What does the blue paper say? Frontline police is the bedrock of policing. If you're going to copy some of it, at least change the word and leave bedrock out and change it to something else. The blue paper has some other ideas. It's surrounded, though, by management jargon. Real-time fusion centres. We worry about privatisation. We worry about, especially about the proposal to close local police stations in favour of superstations and a reduction of first response police officers. The extension of that within the blue paper is we're going to close police stations, we're going to have self-help kiosks. You can actually go up there, put a thumbprint on and report on bail. You can go there and report your own crime at a kiosk. We'll downgrade police stations so they're only open at certain hours. We're concerned about the potential closure of regional and country stations. Those one-man police stations are the fabric of the community. And I've said it before, if you tear that material, the fabric of the community, you'll never be able to mend it. Some people tell me, and some members say, maybe the downgrading of Drysdale, Port Arlington and Queenscliff is a sign of the blue paper, because on the 10th of August those stations are being downgraded. This approach has been tried before. In 1990, Queensland Police adopted a model. And if you read it, the model talked about having super stations, having cluster stations. Well, guess what? That's what I see in the blue paper. So they closed 5 stations in Brisbane North. Well, in the last decade, they've rebuilt them, reopened them, because the police officers got disconnected from the community. And it was at great cost to do that. I repeat, we're not against task forces. They do a great job, but not at the expense of first response police officers who are part of the community. I think the police should be reflective of community views which are expressed through a political process. Governments are elected on those policies, which in turn the police force has to deliver. We should not get in a situation where Victoria Police dictates to the government what the policy is, and the government then dictates to the community what they should get. It doesn't work that way. It's never worked that way in 300 years. It works the other way. The community must have a view. Governments develop policy around that. They're elected on that policy, and then it's a job for Victoria Police to implement that policy. As I said before, the government and the opposition may think their job on community safety is done. Well, you need to think again. The Police Association commissioned a Galaxy poll with a sample of more than 1,000 Victorians, comparable to the most reliable poll taken by any other organisation. The majority of Victorians are opposed to reducing police on the beat and in police stations. The majority of voters would be concerned about a negative impact on the community if the numbers of police is not increased during the next term of government. 4 out of 5 Victorians, 82%, favour all police stations being funded to maintain a minimum level of service. The key 4 things that the public identified within the next 4 years, which they say are the most important things to them in a law and order campaign, this is not what we say as the Police Association. This is what the community says. Number 1, family violence. Number 2, patrolling the streets by police. Nothing new. Tackling alcohol and drug-related violence, public disorder, assaults and street crime. These are the areas of crime that demand more first responders, not less. The message from our members and the message from the public is clear. Don't mess with community-based policing. By all means, let's have the latest technology. Let's have the most highly trained specialists in all areas of crime. Let them use technology and expertise to break crime gangs and to follow that money trail. But let's not abandon 2 centuries-old philosophy created by Sir Robert Peel, the grandfather of modern policing, when he created community policing model based on first responders. 21st technology might be crushing the modern versions of the printing press after 6 centuries, but police visibility, community-based policing and Sir Robert Peel have a long way to go in these days of domestic violence, street crime, ice and alcohol-related crime. What do the public want? I think the public want police, not a PowerPoint. I think the public want a police response, not a management theory. I think the public want a rapid police response, not a thesis. I think they want their streets watched, not whitewashed. Politicians, if you don't accept what the community says, I think you do it at your own peril. Thank you.
Well, there was a fair bit of meat in that. I mean, the idea of this sort of sci-fi, these kiosks where somebody on bail can go and press their thumb on a screen and be recognised. Mind boggles, particularly if they were sex offenders, of course. So, a couple of questions. If you were Chief Commissioner, what 3 things would you first do?
Well, the first thing I'd do is I'd come out of my ivory tower and I'd actually drive around the state, talk to my members, but actually work somewhere where it's busy and get in the car. Because whilst he's briefed by senior officers, sometimes I think those people lose touch with perspective. So I think that's the number one thing that needs to be done. Number 2 is listen to the community. I haven't got a third one.
Well, one of the things the Blue Paper looked at was trying to establish a relationship or, no-go zone for politicians, because we've got the Office of Constable, which means that, the police are there to enforce the law, the government is there to set the law, and the courts are there to oversee it all. And that line tends to blur, and so what they're trying to do is establish, you stay on your side of the fence, we'll stay there. In your experience, 1, have you ever received any political pressure in an investigation, or 2, any internal pressure from senior officers?
I've never received political pressure, and I've never received pressure from internal office. I've been allowed to basically do what I wanted. But one thing I think the Blue Paper is fundamentally flawed, and that is the principle or the idea that you can go to government and you can say to government, this is my 4-year projected plan, these are the key performance indicators, I want to close 5 police stations, I want to employ 10 accountants, I only want to employ 500 police, and then the government somehow set policy around that. You're doing it in reverse, and I think unless the community is on board and that's what the community want, then you've got to have the politicians on board. The Blue Paper can't work. You can't come back in reverse.
One more and then we'll take some questions from the floor. The cost fund, the legal defence fund, how does that work? Because police who are suspended, some get funded by the association, which is of course the money taken from members, and some don't. How does it work?
There's a very set criteria which has to be met. First of all, the initial application is heard by three members, 2 of which off the executive and an independent member. If they're funded, well then that's it. If they're not funded, there's a right of appeal to the executive, but it's not an absolute right that you'll be funded. There is a set criteria which needs to be applied. And I'm happy today to answer any questions. I don't think anything's off limits.
So, from the floor, any questions? David.
Can't all be shocked.
David, off you go. No, yeah.
Okay, well, speak loudly. David Polton, right, next few words. You were speaking before about mental illness, and I wonder if you'd reflect back, as having been a police officer for over 30 years, in terms of the sort of community landscape. 35 years ago, the last generation, we had a much more institutional approach to dealing with mental illness. Do you find that policing today and the safety of your members, is that greatly affected by the way in which mental illness is now treated in the community, and would you have any views about whether whether policies on that area should be looked at in this context of police numbers?
I think mental illness is a major issue. 1 in 5, the current stats will say that we will suffer a depressive episode or anxiety. If you went back 30 years ago, yes, there was institutions, but now there's little small community groups. But the biggest issue I've seen change in the last 10 years is the effect of illicit drugs, ice, heroin, cocaine, cannabis on the community. Our police officers now find that every shift they're basically tied up with either family violence issue or mental health issue. The mental health issue changed on the 1st of July this year, which means that police officers, if they suspect someone is either going to self-harm or they have a mental illness, you have to take them to a hospital. But it changed a bit further, which says that the police officers must remain there until that person has had a psychiatric assessment, Section 351 of the Mental Health Act. So what it means now is police are tied up a lot longer with those issues. They're still community issues. I think sometimes police officers or the police department take on too many things. Eventually something has to give. The rubber band is stretched to the limit as it is now, and unless we have more officers, that will break.
Further to that, before the changes, once every 63 minutes, a police unit has to take somebody to hospital because they're so mentally disturbed. Now you can imagine what the drain that is on the manpower, and equally all recruits are now being taught different techniques to deal with it because it is just so routine to deal with it. Suburban police are now saying, you know, local hoods who are on the ice are so paranoid that they're now starting to carry firearms, which means the long-term impact for junior police is when they pull a car up, they're going to deal with somebody who might be armed and mentally disturbed because of what they've been taking. Any other?
Yeah, John, just following up on that. Ron, I understand the argument about the first responder, increasing the numbers. You mentioned here now that drugs, particularly like ice and pardon me, more sophisticated drugs that are around at the moment, are a big part of the crime scene. I understand what first responders can do in helping the immediate problem, but is enough being done to crack the drug scene and the drug culture in Victoria?
We do have a drug squad, and again, we're not against task forces working on that issue and tracking the source back. But I've been around a long time. Heroin was big in the 1980s. Then another drug came and took place of it. If you can eliminate greed, human greed, will fix the problem, because that's where it is within the money. You can have a simplistic model and say, I'll have an accountant and I'll have that and I'll attack ice and all the manufacturers of ice, and the effect will go away. It won't happen. The effect will still be there for a long time to come. I think we're struggling with it, but yesterday was a major seizure by Australian Federal Police and the Australian Crimes Commission, which was at least a positive step.
$130 million worth of ice seized yesterday, and the price and purity of the drug on the street will not change at all, which shows you the iron law of organised crime is where there is a demand, there will be a supply. And if we can't stop our kids taking drugs, then the police cannot stop it. And if you look at the job of police, as Ron said, how at the rubber band, if you look at the job of police when there was 6 o'clock closing to what we are now, a major city, a much better place, but every time we do something extra, the police have to pick that up. The job has changed so much, so the old model simply doesn't work. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Amy. I'm from Newcastle. Thank you for hearing my question. I would like to ask, as a young woman, how safe is it for me to be in this city, especially at night time?
Well, one of the first thing I think that police have to do is to look after everyone on the street. I don't know how old you are, but my daughter was 22, is still 22, and 1 o'clock on Saturday morning she rings and says, Dad, come up and get me from the city, and she's in King Street. I've got to tell you, I wouldn't feel safe wandering around King Street at 1 o'clock in the morning. Yes, there's street patrols, yes, there's CCTV, but it's about looking after each other. And I think as a society sometimes we've forgotten the basics to look after each other. By all means go out and have a good time, but make sure someone is responsible to get you home in a safe manner. Mr O'Brien.
What's your view, Ron, of the PSOs and the future of the PSO program?
One of the things that often is referred to is that a visible police presence does not reduce crime. But then hang on a minute, we've got 920 or 940 PSOs on railway stations. They've had a massive impact on reducing crime. People feel safe around railway stations. I know both sides of politics are intending on keeping it, and I think it's a great thing.
You were talking earlier about drugs and tackling the supply. That doesn't seem to be working. Have the police got any ideas in thinking of tackling the demand so that people who use drugs can be charged and suffer a severe penalty, which will reduce, I think, the demand if people find that they have a jail term, the young person has a jail term, and suddenly they can't travel overseas because they can't get a visa to certain countries. Will that make any difference?
There are penalties for drug use, but admittedly they're minor. I've dealt with a lot of drug addicts, and unless they want to give it up themselves, you can make them go to rehab, do a lot of things. Until they hit rock bottom, they won't change. So yes, you can incarcerate them, but unless they get their mental state up here to change, sadly I think there'll still be a demand.
I wasn't thinking actually of addicts because I was thinking of the recreational drug users, people who use cocaine, people who use other drugs and yet hold down a responsible position and tend to use that. They have the demand and the criminals supply that.
First, I don't agree with your comment, recreational drugs. I don't think there's anything that's recreational. They're illicit and they're illegal. So if you take them and you get caught, you get charged. Can we stop the business people who snort cocaine? I don't think so. First of all, you've got to apprehend them. It's a massive problem. If I had the solution, I'd be a multi-millionaire. Sadly, I don't have the solution.
Well, if they were going to lock up every illicit drug user, I tell you what, I'd be buying shares in G4 because we'd have about 50 more jails. And secondly, if they were going to do that, we wouldn't have any sub-editors. So. Any more questions? Jeffrey?
I watched a TV documentary last month on British police and the pressure their British police forces are under to achieve set goals and results and the penalties they face in terms of funding and resources if they don't. Is that an issue here? Is there quotas or KPI threats an issue here?
No, there's no quotas, and if there was, the Police Association would be very active in that area. Part of policing is community policing. Part of it is about a visible presence. Part of it is about prevention, and I don't think we should have quotas.
Ron, you were on radio yesterday, I think, on the issue of electronic tags on intervention order repeat offenders. Is that the sort of thing that's in use anywhere else in the world, or is it the sort of thing that can be successful?
After yesterday, someone told me it's in use in the Netherlands, but I haven't checked. All we wanted to do yesterday was put the idea out there. Currently, there is no system anywhere in Australia which actually alerts the victim of a potential danger. They're going to trial something down in Gippsland whereby you'll have an alarm which will go to a security company, and then it'll automatically put a video on and capture, as someone said to me, the evidence. Well, that's all good, but depending on the response time of the police. It's not much good having a video of you being stabbed to death, so all we wanted to do is have some debate around it. I think it can work. You would have to have maybe strike three. You would go to court like and make application that the victim was in extreme risk, and then it's a matter for the court. But it's for community debate. But I think it was one way in which it could work, and we've had reasonably good support across the board.
Ron was talking earlier about how things have changed in the relationship between the homicide squad and individual reporters, but that's also changed at the top end. The Victoria Police used to be a really strong influence in law, where the Chief Commissioner would come out and start debates on things like majority verdicts and sentencing. But over the years, that role has been taken from them as more and more governments have squeezed them to say, don't make any statements on policy. So for us in the media, the Police Association is not just a union, but as you saw this week with the Herald Sun story, a really important catalyst to some sensible debates on law and order and justice. So, I really do believe that when you're writing a story in that area, come to the association, because they are representing the actual practitioners, as you would go to the medical authorities if you were doing a story about hospitals.
One last question from me. What's your personal view on capital punishment?
This is not the view of the Police Association, my personal view. I don't agree with it. I charged someone once by the name of Peter Samuel Smith. and it caused me a lot of angst. He told me he didn't do it, and in the end I proved he didn't do it. So I don't think it's a deterrent. You know, most people that I've interviewed in relation to serious crime never ever think about the penalty.
Can I just, sorry, if I may just follow on from that though, I mean, clearly, and for a while now we've seen that there's a strong spirit in large sections of the community for tougher penalties, for tougher responses to crime and the consequences of it. Do you think that works? I mean, we see already we've got an exploding and possibly exploding prison population. Is tougher sentencing the way to go?
I think sentencing has got to reflect community attitudes, and it's the community attitudes that's driven the tougher penalties. So suspended sentences will go come September this year. What will it do? It'll put more people in prison. Yes, the infrastructure has to be built. But, you know, I listen to people sometimes, I say, how did that person get such a light sentence and there's a complaint? Is it manifestly inadequate? And if it is, there's a change. So the Attorney-General has only changed in answer to what the community, I feel, is only in answer to what the community want. So if you don't agree with it, you know, you challenge it again. But I think they're changed on the basis of community views.
You were just saying before too how the government's fallen short of police quotas for frontline police. Will the police union be throwing the support behind a particular party for the state election?
We're totally apolitical. You know, we'll go out there, we'll lobby on behalf of the members, we'll lobby on behalf of the community. We've done a lot of research, we think we know what the key issues are, and then it's up to our members to vote accordingly. They vote for whoever they want to vote for.
Corruption in the police force. You once left the force because of a corruption issue. Do you think it's still a big issue? Do you think it's systemic?
I don't think it's systemic. I think Victoria Police has moved on a long way from that. We're only a reflection of the society. Will police officers make mistakes? Will police officers commit some sort of crime? Of course they do. Right? But we're a reflection of the community, and Victoria Police does its best to eliminate those.
Ron, you seem to be saying that the economy is driving police strategy, and yet you seem to be saying that police strategy is not working. What would your alternative priority be rather than the economy?
The Chief Commissioner's Blue Paper is about economy of scale, I suppose, and about having a bucket of money which he wants to determine how he spends it. But that's not what the community want. The community still want their local police station because that actually makes them feel safe. So I say it has to be the community that drives the policy. The community have to have a view about whether they have a local police station or not. The community have to have a view about a whole range of things. If we're going to get rid of, say, marijuana and say, let's make it legal, that's got to be a community view which in turn develops policy, and if a government gets elected on it, well, it comes in.
So, sorry, if I can just ask again. Are you then suggesting that it's got to be driven from the community's us rather than politicians' doubts?
Surely that's how it operates now. I can't see it changing. Why would it come from? If you're a local politician, you don't want to be told how you're going to operate in your thing. You take on community views. You listen to what the community say. You go to your local member and you say, listen, I want this police station to open, or I want to legalise marijuana. That local politician then goes to state, and there's an election, and they might say we're going to get rid of marijuana, and they win on that policy. The next thing is it's gone. That's how it's operated for hundreds of years. I can't see how Victoria Police can drive it the other way. If Ken Lay, if he wants to change certain things and have a lawyer or have an accountant, it's pretty easy. Put up a business plan and go to government and say, I want X amount of dollars to fix this problem. Right? So he still can do certain things. But the bottom line is the community get the police force that they actually want, and that's how it should operate.
Last one.
Sorry, Ron, you just speaking about legalising marijuana. Where does the Police Association and or you personally stand on the subject? Illegal use or otherwise?
Whilst it's illegal, it's illegal.
Should that be changed?
If they want to change it in relation to medical things, you know, we'd go away, we'd have a debate about it, we'd think about it, and we'd probably form a policy on it. But as it stands now, it's illegal, so it's illegal. Thank you.
I think we're all done. Thanks very much, Ron.
Ron, thank you very, very much for a forthright and very engaging address, and look forward to seeing more details of the campaign as we get closer to the election. Best of luck. Thank you for your time, and thank you also to John for being an excellent moderator. I think I've got an idea now. We could have another event where Silvester is the guest and maybe Ron could be the moderator, and we can sort of mix and match and we get another crowd like this. I have some good news. Ron has a bit of time to spare in the best traditions and the memories of the good old days of police and journalist engagement. He will be hanging around. The bar will remain open. It's a cash bar, unfortunately. But happy to talk, and if you've got the time, please hang about. But if you don't have the time and you have to go, thanks for coming, and look forward to seeing you at another Press Club event. Thank you.